She witnessed her husband's assassination in the back of a limousine, his blood on her iconic pink suit. 5 years later, she married one of the world's richest men, shocking a nation that thought it owned her grief. She was criticized, idolized, photographed relentlessly, and pursued by paparazzi until her dying day. Yet somehow, through it all, she maintained a dignity and privacy that seemed impossible in the modern age. This is not just the story of America's most famous First Lady. This is the story of a woman who transformed personal tragedy into quiet strength, who raised 2 children under the most intense public scrutiny imaginable, who reinvented herself repeatedly while the world watched and judged. A woman who was so much more than the myths we created about her. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis. 3 last names, each representing a different chapter of an extraordinary life. Born into privilege, married into power, widowed into legend, and ultimately triumphant in her own right. She was called Jackie by millions who never met her, yet those who truly knew her called her something else entirely. Welcome to her story. Chapter 1. The Golden Childhood That Wasn't. July 28, 1929. Southampton Hospital, New York. Jacqueline Bouvier entered the world weighing 8 pounds, a healthy baby girl born to parents whose marriage was already showing cracks that would soon become chasms. Her father, John Verneau Bouvier III, was a stockbroker who everyone called Black Jack for his perpetually tanned skin and his rakish good looks. He was charming, sophisticated, and utterly unreliable. He loved women, loved gambling, loved drinking, and loved his daughters, though not always in that order and not always consistently. Black Jack came from old money, or what passed for old money in America. The Bouviers were descended from French immigrants who had made their fortune in real estate and maintained their position through careful marriages and careful investing. They had a coat of arms, a family history they liked to embellish, and just enough money to maintain appearances, though the reality was often shakier than the image suggested. Jackie's mother, Janet Norton Lee, came from a very different background, though she spent her life trying to obscure that fact. The Lees were Irish Catholic, self-made, and considerably wealthier than the Bouviers, but they lacked the social pedigree Janet craved. Her father, James Lee, had clawed his way up from poverty to become a successful real estate developer and banker. He was tough, shrewd, and determined that his daughters would marry into the society that had snubbed him. Janet was beautiful, ambitious, and hard as nails beneath her social graces. She was an accomplished equestrian, a demanding mother, and a woman who valued appearance and propriety above almost everything else. She married Black Jack Bouvier because he represented everything she wanted: old family name, social connections, and that indefinable quality called breeding. The marriage was a disaster almost from the start. Black Jack drank too much and chased women relentlessly. Janet was cold, controlling, and unforgiving. They fought constantly, made up dramatically, and created a household where appearances were everything and genuine warmth was in short supply. Into this volatile environment came Jacqueline, and 4 years later her sister Carolyn Lee, called Lee. The 2 girls grew up in a world of privilege that was also deeply unstable. They spent summers in East Hampton, winters in New York City, and countless hours trying to navigate their parents' toxic relationship. Jackie adored her father. Black Jack, for all his faults, was affectionate with his daughters in a way that Janet never was. He took them to the circus, to museums, to Central Park. He told them they were beautiful and special and could do anything. He was also frequently absent, often drunk, and occasionally brought his girlfriends around in ways that humiliated Janet and confused his daughters. Janet, meanwhile, ran the household with military precision. She insisted on perfect manners, perfect posture, perfect everything. She was not warm or cuddly. She did not offer easy affection. But she was determined that her daughters would have every advantage, every skill, every accomplishment that would allow them to marry well and marry up. Jackie learned to ride horses almost before she could walk. By age 5, she was competing in horse shows and winning. She learned French from a governess, learned to draw and paint, learned to dance and play piano. She learned, above all, to present a perfect facade to the world, no matter what chaos existed behind it. This skill would serve her for the rest of her life. She was a beautiful child, though not in a conventional way. She had wide-set eyes, a square jaw, and a gap between her front teeth that she hated, but that somehow added to her charm. She was athletic and tomboyish, more comfortable on horseback than in a drawing room, though she learned to be comfortable in both. She was also fiercely intelligent. She read voraciously, everything from fairy tales to history to French novels she probably shouldn't have been reading at her age. She wrote poetry and stories. She drew elaborate pictures and created entire imaginary worlds. She had an inner life that was rich and complex, and she learned early to keep it private. In 1936, when Jackie was 7, her parents' marriage finally collapsed completely. The divorce was ugly, filled with accusations of adultery on both sides, though Blackjack's infidelities were far more numerous and better documented. Janet won custody of the girls, as mothers almost always did, and set about erasing Blackjack from their lives as much as legally possible. The divorce devastated Jackie. She lost daily access to the parent she loved most, the one who had given her affection and attention and made her feel special. She was old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to process it healthily. She retreated further into books, into horses, into the elaborate inner world where she had control. Janet, meanwhile, wasted no time in finding a new husband. In 1942, she married Hugh Dudley Auchincloss Jr., known as Hughie, a Standard Oil heir who was exactly what Janet had always wanted: genuinely wealthy, socially impeccable, and utterly boring. Hughie was kind in a distant, vague sort of way. He had been married twice before and had children from both previous marriages. He was considerably older than Janet, set in his ways, and more interested in his investments than in raising stepchildren. But he had 2 magnificent estates, Marywood in Virginia and Hammersmith Farm in Newport, Rhode Island. For Janet, this was paradise. For Jackie, it was gilded exile. Suddenly, Jackie had step-siblings, half-siblings, enormous houses, and even more pressure to be perfect. She had everything money could buy, except the one thing she wanted: her father's consistent presence. Blackjack remained in her life, but as a weekend visitor, someone who had to ask permission to see his own daughters, someone whose influence Janet worked constantly to minimize. Jackie learned to navigate between 2 worlds: her father's world of charm and affection and unreliability, and her mother's world of wealth and control and impossible standards. She learned to be whoever each situation required. She learned to hide her true self behind whatever mask was appropriate. And she learned that love was conditional, unpredictable, and often painful. These lessons, learned in childhood, would shape everything that came after. Chapter 2. Debutante with Depth. By the time Jackie was a teenager, she had transformed from a tomboyish child into something more complex and interesting. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the obvious blonde bombshell way that was popular in the 1940s. She had dark hair, unusual wide-set eyes, and a figure that was athletic rather than curvy. She looked different, spoke differently, carried herself differently. She stood out. She attended the prestigious Chopin School in New York City, then Miss Porter's School in Connecticut, institutions designed to polish wealthy girls into perfect society wives. Jackie excelled academically, particularly literature and history and languages, but she also excelled at being difficult. She was rebellious in small, clever ways. She smoked when it wasn't allowed. She broke curfew. She questioned authority in ways that were just short of openly defiant. Her teachers found her brilliant but challenging. She had a sharp wit that could be cutting, a tendency to mock pretension, even while benefiting from the most pretentious institutions imaginable. She wrote satirical poetry about her classmates and teachers. She drew unflattering cartoons. She was not trying to be popular. She was trying to be interesting. In 1947, at 18, Jackie enrolled at Vassar College, one of the elite Seven Sisters schools. She studied literature and art history, continued her French studies, and generally found the whole experience rather boring. Vassar was full of wealthy girls preparing to be wealthy wives, and Jackie, despite being one of them, found it all rather limiting. So she did something unexpected. She applied for and won a spot in the Vassar Junior Year Abroad program, spending 1,950 at the Sorbonne in Paris. This year would prove to be one of the most formative of her life. Paris in 1949 was still recovering from the war, but already reasserting itself as the cultural capital of the world. Jackie lived with a French family, attended lectures at the Sorbonne, and fell completely in love with the city, the language, the culture, the art, the entire French way of being. She went to the Louvre constantly. She attended the opera and ballet. She traveled through France and to other parts of Europe. She discovered existentialism, French cinema, haute couture, and a way of thinking that was more sophisticated and complex than anything she'd encountered in America. More importantly, she discovered that she could be herself in Paris in a way she couldn't be at home. In France, being intellectual wasn't unfeminine. Being interested in art and literature and ideas wasn't strange. She could be serious and frivolous, smart and stylish, all at once, without apology. She also had her first serious romance with a young man whose name history has not clearly preserved, but who represented everything Paris meant to her: sophistication, culture, worldliness. It ended when she returned to America, as such romances always do, but it confirmed for her that there was a bigger, more interesting world than the one her mother had planned for her. When Jackie returned to the United States in 1950, she didn't go back to Vassar. Instead, she transferred to George Washington University in Washington, D.C., ostensibly to be closer to Marywood, but really because she found the Washington scene more stimulating than campus life. She completed her degree in French literature in 1951, graduating with honors. But the question remained, what does a wealthy, educated young woman do in 1951? The expected answer was simple: find a husband. The society pages were full of engagement announcements of girls Jackie had known at school. Her mother was certainly pushing in that direction, arranging introductions to suitable young men from suitable families. Jackie went through the motions. In December 1951, she was named Debutante of the Year by Society columnist Igor Tassini. It was the kind of honor that was supposed to launch a girl into the marriage market. The announcement described her as a beautiful brunette with classic features and the daintiness of Dresden porcelain. The reality was considerably more complex. Jackie had no intention of becoming Dresden porcelain, decorative and fragile and sitting on a shelf. She wanted to do something, though what that something might be wasn't entirely clear. Society in 1951 offered educated women very few options: teacher, nurse, secretary, or wife. Anything else was considered vaguely improper. So Jackie did something that surprised her family. She got a job. Through a family connection, she became the inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times-Herald, one of the capital's major newspapers. Her job was to roam around Washington with a camera, ask people questions on various topics, photograph them, and write up their responses in a breezy column that ran several times a week. It wasn't serious journalism, but it was journalism. She was working, earning her own money, meeting people outside her social circle, and learning about the city and how it functioned. She interviewed everyone from tourists to politicians, asking questions like, "What do you think of women in politics?" And should a candidate's wife campaign for her husband? The job gave her access, taught her to talk to strangers, and gave her an education in politics and public life that would prove invaluable. It also put her in places where she might meet interesting people, which is exactly what happened. Chapter 3. Enter Jack Kennedy. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was everything Janet Bouvier Auchincloss could have wanted for her daughter, and several things she definitely didn't want. He came from a wealthy, prominent family. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., had made a fortune in banking, bootlegging, stock manipulation, and Hollywood. His mother, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, came from Boston Irish political royalty. Her father had been mayor of Boston. The Kennedys were rich, ambitious, Catholic, and Irish, which in WASP society of the 1950s was a complicated combination. They had money but not breeding, power but not refinement, ambition but not subtlety. They were everything the old money establishment looked down on, and they were determined to conquer that establishment anyway. Jack Kennedy had been raised to seek power. His older brother, Joe Jr., had been the designated political star of the family, groomed for the presidency from childhood. But Joe was killed in World War II, and the mantle fell to Jack, who had his own wartime heroism story from PT 109 and his own considerable charm. By 1951, Jack was a congressman from Massachusetts, young and handsome and perpetually surrounded by women. He had a reputation as a playboy, which was deserved, and as someone not particularly interested in settling down, which was also deserved. He had health problems he concealed carefully, including Addison's disease and chronic back pain from his war injuries. He was taking numerous medications, seeing numerous doctors, and presenting to the world an image of youthful vigor that was partly real and partly carefully constructed. Jackie first met Jack Kennedy at a dinner party in May 1952. She was 22, he was 35. She was working as the inquiring camera girl. He was running for Senate. The attraction wasn't immediate lightning bolt, at least not for her. He was charming, certainly, but she'd met charming men before. Her father had taught her that charm could be a cover for unreliability, but Jack was persistent. He called her, took her to dinner, pursued her with the same focused intensity he brought to political campaigns, and gradually she found herself intrigued. He was intelligent, well-read, genuinely interested in ideas. He'd written a book, Why England Slept, about Britain's failure to prepare for World War II. He could discuss history, politics, literature. He wasn't just a pretty face in a good suit. He was also deeply ambivalent about marriage. He liked women, plural. The idea of limiting himself to one seemed to genuinely puzzle him. His father had been serially unfaithful to his mother, carrying on a long affair with Gloria Swanson that was an open secret. Jack had absorbed the lesson that marriage didn't mean fidelity, just discretion. Jackie, meanwhile, was getting pressure from her mother. At 23, she was getting dangerously old by 1950 standards for unmarried women. Janet had found her wealthy, suitable husband in Hughie. It was time for Jackie to do the same. And here was a Kennedy, wealthy, handsome, bound for great things. Never mind the Irish Catholic background. They were rich enough and powerful enough that it didn't matter. The courtship was stop and start. Jack would pursue her intensely, then disappear for weeks. Jackie would be charmed, then annoyed, then charmed again. She was also seeing other men, including John Husted, a stockbroker from a good family. In fact, she got engaged to Husted in December 1951, received a sapphire and diamond ring, and then broke it off a few months later. The official reason was vague. The real reason might have been that Jack Kennedy was more interesting than any stockbroker could ever be. Jack won his Senate race in November 1952, defeating Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. a victory that established him as a rising star in the Democratic Party. His father was already thinking about the presidency. His mother was thinking about grandchildren, and Jack was thinking that marriage might be good for his political image, even if he wasn't entirely enthusiastic about the reality of it. In June 1953, Jack finally proposed. It wasn't particularly romantic. He presented it almost as a logical next step, something that made sense for both of them. Jackie said yes, though she must have had reservations. She was marrying a man who was charming and brilliant, but also distant and unfaithful, and likely to remain so. She was marrying into a family that was overwhelming and intrusive and had very definite ideas about how Kennedy wives should behave. But she was also marrying someone who could give her access to a world much bigger than being a society wife in Newport. She was marrying power, possibility, and purpose. It was a calculated decision dressed up as romance, which perhaps made it very appropriate for both of them. The wedding was set for September 12, 1953, in Newport, Rhode Island. It would be the society event of the year. Chapter 4: The Wedding and the Reality. September 12, 1953. Dawn clear and beautiful in Newport. Perfect weather for what was being called the social event of the decade. St. Mary's Roman Catholic. Church was decorated with pink gladioli and white chrysanthemums. More than 3,000 spectators lined the streets outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bride. Jackie wore a gown of ivory silk taffeta designed by Anne Lowe, a black designer who was one of the most talented couturiers in America, but whose name was rarely mentioned in society coverage of the era. The dress had a portrait neckline, fitted bodice, and a full skirt with intricate tucking and embroidery. Her veil was silk, held in place by a lace cap that had belonged to her grandmother. She looked like a princess from a fairy tale. The ceremony was performed by Archbishop Richard Cushing of Boston, a Kennedy family friend, and the reception at Hammersmith Farm hosted somewhere between 800 and 1,200 guests, depending on whose account you believe. It was lavish, expensive, and carefully choreographed. Joe Kennedy had largely paid for it, insisting it be grand enough to launch his son toward national prominence. Jackie's father was supposed to walk her down the aisle. Black Jack Bouvier had been looking forward to it, had bought a new suit, had been on his best behavior for weeks. But the night before the wedding, alone in his hotel room, he drank and drank. By the morning of the wedding, he was in no condition to attend, let alone escort his daughter. Janet, infuriated but not surprised, made the quick decision that Hughie would walk Jackie down the aisle instead. Jackie was devastated but hid it behind her perfect composure. This was perhaps the perfect metaphor for her childhood. Her beloved but unreliable father failing her at the crucial moment, replaced by her mother's acceptable but distant substitute. The honeymoon was spent in Acapulco, Mexico, at a villa lent to them by the President of Mexico. It should have been romantic. Instead, Jack spent much of the time on the phone with his office or reading books. Jackie later confided to friends that she spent their honeymoon alone more than she'd expected. It was a preview of what marriage to Jack Kennedy would actually be like. They returned to Washington and moved into a house in Georgetown that was charming but modest by Kennedy's standards. Jackie threw herself into being a political wife, a role for which she was both perfectly suited and deeply unsuited. She was poised, educated, spoke multiple languages, and looked magnificent at political events. She was also intensely private, hated small talk, and had no natural gift for the backslapping, crowd-working aspects of politics. She learned quickly that being married to Jack meant being part of the Kennedy clan, and the Kennedy clan was like nothing she'd experienced. They were loud, competitive, aggressive, and constantly together. There were touch football games that turned violent, dinner table conversations that became debates, and an overall energy level that was exhausting. They also had very clear ideas about what Kennedy wives should be: supportive, uncomplaining and definitely not more interesting than their husbands. Rose Kennedy, Jack's mother, was particularly challenging. She was devout, controlling, and had survived Joe Kennedy's infidelities by retreating into Catholicism and denial. She expected her daughters-in-law to be properly Catholic, to produce children efficiently, and to never, ever complain about anything. Jackie found her cold and judgmental. Joe Kennedy, the patriarch, was crude, demanding, and used to getting his way. He also clearly found Jackie attractive, which created uncomfortable dynamics. But he recognized her value as a political asset, her sophistication and style, and he began to see how she could be used to advance Jack's career. Meanwhile, Jack was rarely home. He was traveling constantly for Senate business, making speeches, building a national profile. And when he was in Washington, he was often out with friends, at parties, meeting with colleagues. The pattern that would define their marriage was already clear. Jack would do whatever Jack wanted, and Jackie would manage her feelings about that privately. She also learned quickly that Jack was still seeing other women. He wasn't particularly discreet about it among his friends, though he was careful about public appearances. This was how Kennedy men behaved. Joe had modeled it, Jack followed suit. Jackie could accept it, ignore it, and maintain her dignity, or she could make a fuss and be seen as difficult. She chose dignity and silence, at least publicly. In private, she coped by creating her own life. She redecorated their house obsessively. She read voraciously. She took art classes and French conversation classes. She spent time with her sister Lee, who had also married and was also finding that marriage was more complicated than the fairy tale version suggested. The two sisters became closer than ever, confidants navigating the tricky waters of marriages to powerful, difficult men. In August 1956, Jackie became pregnant. It should have been a joyous occasion, but the pregnancy was difficult from the start. She was sick constantly, exhausted, and Jack was largely absent, focused on maneuvering for the vice presidential nomination at the Democratic National Convention. In fact, when Jackie went into premature labor in late August and delivered a stillborn daughter they had planned to name Arabella, Jack was in the Mediterranean on a yacht with friends. He didn't rush home immediately. It took days and frantic calls from his family to get him to understand the seriousness of the situation and return to his grieving wife. The loss of Arabella was devastating for Jackie. She had wanted the baby desperately, had endured a difficult pregnancy, and then suffered the trauma of delivery only to lose her child. And Jack hadn't been there. He'd been off enjoying himself while she went through the worst experience of her life. This was the low point of their marriage. Jackie seriously considered divorce. She confided in her stepfather, in her priest, and close friends. But divorce was impossible for the wife of a Catholic senator with presidential ambitions. And perhaps she also recognized that despite everything, she and Jack were suited to each other in odd ways. They were both private people playing public roles, both more complex than they appeared, both ambitious in their own ways. They stayed together, but something had changed. Jackie became harder, more self-protective, more realistic about who Jack was and what marriage to him meant. She would be a political wife, would support his ambitions, would play her role. But she would also maintain her own inner life, her own interests, her own self separate from being Mrs. John F. Kennedy. Chapter 5. Becoming Jackie Kennedy. After the loss of Arabella, Jackie pulled back from public life for a while. She was grieving, she was angry at Jack, and she needed time to decide whether she could actually continue in this marriage. But slowly, gradually, she came back. She had made her decision, she would stay, but on terms she could live with. In 1957, Jack published Profiles in Courage, a book about senators who had taken principled stands at great political cost. The book won the Pulitzer Prize and became a bestseller, significantly raising Jack's national profile. There were persistent rumors, never fully resolved, about how much of the book Jack actually wrote versus how much was written by his speechwriter Ted Sorensen and others. What's certain is that Jackie did substantial research and editing work on the project, though her contributions were never publicly acknowledged. This became her pattern. She contributed significantly to Jack's success while remaining in the background. She advised him on everything from policy to personnel to presentation. She had excellent political instincts and good judgment about people. Jack often took her advice, though he rarely credited her publicly. On November 27, 1957, Jackie gave birth to Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, a healthy baby girl. The delivery was by cesarean section, and Jackie's recovery was difficult, but she finally had the child she desperately wanted. Carolyn was the one thing in her life that was entirely hers, not Jack's or the Kennedys or the public's. She was fiercely protective of her daughter from the start. Jack, for his part, was a distant but affectionate father when he was around. He liked children in theory, enjoyed playing with Carolyn when he was home, but had no interest in the day-to-day work of parenting. That fell to Jackie and to nannies, which was entirely standard for the time and social class. By 1958, Jack was clearly running for president, though he wouldn't announce officially for another 2 years. The strategy was to build name recognition, cement relationships with party leaders, and position himself as the young, fresh alternative to the older generation of Democratic politicians. And increasingly, Jackie was part of that strategy. Joe Kennedy and Jack's campaign team recognized that Jackie was an asset. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and different from typical political wives. She could speak French and Spanish, could discuss art and culture, could charm foreign dignitaries and American voters alike. She needed to be used carefully because she could come across as too elite, too sophisticated, too foreign almost. But used correctly, she could be valuable. Jackie approached this new role with her characteristic intelligence and caution. She studied other political wives, figuring out what worked and what didn't. She learned to give short, gracious answers to intrusive questions. She learned to smile through exhaustion and discomfort. She learned to be Jackie Kennedy, a character she was creating for public consumption. The 1960 presidential campaign officially kicked off in January, and it was unlike anything America had seen before. Jack was young, handsome, witty, and Catholic, which was both an advantage and a disadvantage. No Catholic had ever been elected president, and anti-Catholic prejudice was still strong in many parts of the country. But he had money, organization, and a compelling narrative. The war hero, the Pulitzer Prize winner, the representative of the new generation ready to lead America into the 1960s, and he had Jackie, who was pregnant again, but determined to campaign as much as her doctors would allow. She gave interviews in women's magazines, appeared at campaign events, and wrote a syndicated newspaper column called Campaign Wife that ran in Democratic newspapers across the country. She was learning to perform the role of political wife while maintaining enough of her own personality to seem genuine. The campaign was grueling. Jack's health was worse than the public knew. He was in constant pain from his back and taking numerous medications for his Addison's disease. He was also still seeing other women, including Judith Campbell, who was simultaneously involved with Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana. It was reckless and dangerous, but Jack seemed unable or unwilling to control his appetites. Jackie knew about some of the affairs and suspected others. She handled it the way she handled everything difficult, with public grace and private withdrawal. She focused on Carolyn, on the campaign when she had to, and on maintaining her own sense of self separate from all of it. On November 25, 1960, just weeks after, Jack won the presidency in one of the closest elections in American history. Jackie gave birth to John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Jr., a healthy boy who would be the first baby born to a president-elect in nearly 70 years. The nation was enchanted. Jackie was exhausted but relieved. She now faced a daunting prospect, becoming First Lady of the United States at age 31. She would be the youngest First Lady since Frances Cleveland in the 1880s, and she would be under scrutiny unlike anything she'd experienced before. Every outfit, every word, every decision about her children would be analyzed and criticized in Cobbett. She had 2 months to prepare before the inauguration. 2 months to figure out how to be Jackie Kennedy, First Lady, while protecting Jackie Kennedy, private person. 2 months to transform the character she'd been creating into someone who could handle what was coming. She had no idea how desperately she would need that strength. Chapter 6. The White House Years. January 20th, 1961. Inauguration. Day. Washington was buried under 8 inches of snow from a storm the night before, but the day dawned clear and brutally cold. Jackie, wearing a pillbox hat and fawn-colored coat designed by Oleg Cassini, watched as her husband became the youngest elected president of the United States and the first Catholic to hold the office. Jack's inaugural address was brilliant, containing the famous line, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." Jackie was proud, but also terrified. She understood, perhaps better than Jack did in that moment, that their lives had fundamentally changed. They now belonged to history, to the nation, to the world. Privacy, already limited, would now be virtually impossible. From the start, Jackie was determined to make the role of First Lady her own. She had studied her predecessors carefully. Mamie Eisenhower had been a conventional hostess, focusing on entertaining and supporting her husband. Eleanor Roosevelt had been actively political, involving herself in policy and advocacy. Jackie would do neither. She would focus on culture, on history, on making the White House itself a symbol of American excellence. Her first major project was the restoration of the White House. When the Kennedys moved in, she was appalled at the condition of the place. It looked, she said, like a hotel furnished from a department store catalog. There was little historical significance to most of the furniture, the artwork was mediocre, and the overall effect was bland and uninspired. She decided to transform it into a showcase for American history and artistry. She established the White House Historical Association, recruited experts and donors, and began a systematic effort to acquire period furniture and significant artworks. She personally oversaw every detail, spending hours studying catalogs and consulting with historians. It was exhausting work, but it was also the perfect project for her. It required knowledge, taste, attention to detail, and kept her focused on something other than Jack's absences and infidelities. On February 14th, 1962, CBS aired a tour of the White House with Mrs. John F. Kennedy, a televised special in which Jackie walked viewers through the restored rooms, explaining the history and significance of what they were seeing. She was nervous on camera, her voice sometimes breathy and little girl soft, but she was also knowledgeable and charming. 56 million Americans watched, making it one of the most viewed programs of the year. Jackie became a cultural phenomenon, but she was also struggling. Being First Lady meant constant public appearances, endless receiving lines, exhausting state dinners, and a level of scrutiny that was overwhelming. She was naturally introverted, needed time alone to recharge, and found the endless demands of the role draining. She began to schedule personal time and refuse some public appearances, which drew criticism that she wasn't doing enough. She was also dealing with Jack's continued infidelities. As president, he had more power, more access, and somehow even less discretion. He was seeing Judith Campbell regularly, along with numerous other women. The Secret Service facilitated these encounters, treating them as part of their job. Jackie knew and was humiliated by the knowledge that staff, security, and probably half of Washington were aware of her husband's affairs. Her coping mechanism was to retreat. She spent long periods at Glen Ora, a rented estate in Virginia where she could ride horses and be away from Washington. She took trips with Carolyn and John. She focused intensely on her children. determined that they would have as normal a childhood as possible despite living in the White House. She was also brilliant at her official duties. When she chose to engage with them, state dinners during the Kennedy administration became cultural events. She invited artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals, transforming what had been stuffy diplomatic occasions into genuine celebrations of culture. She invited Pablo Casals to perform, hosted a dinner honoring Nobel Prize winners, and generally signaled that the Kennedy White House valued art and intellect. Her influence extended to fashion and style. Everything she wore was copied instantly. The pillbox hat became an iconic symbol of early 1960s fashion. Her simple sheath dresses, her bouffant hairstyle, her understated elegance became the standard that American women tried to emulate. She was, in a very real sense, setting the aesthetic tone for an entire era. But she was also being reduced to her image. The press covered her clothes more than her restoration work. Women's magazines focused on her as a fashion icon and mother rather than as the intelligent, educated woman she was. She was being turned into exactly what Shiti tried to avoid, a beautiful object to be looked at rather than a person to be taken seriously. International trips offered some relief and some of her greatest triumphs. In June 1961, Jack and Jackie traveled to France to meet with President Charles de Gaulle. Jackie charmed de Gaulle completely, speaking to him in flawless French, discussing French art and literature with knowledge and enthusiasm. At a press conference, Jack joked, "I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris." It was funny and true. She had completely overshadowed him. Similar triumphs followed in Vienna, London, and later in South America and India. Jackie was better than any American diplomat at building goodwill and positive relationships. She was an asset to American foreign policy, which was an unusual role for a first lady, but one she filled brilliantly. In August 1963, Jackie gave birth to Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, 5.5 weeks premature. The baby boy suffered from hyaline membrane disease, a respiratory condition. Despite the best medical care available, Patrick died 2 days after birth. It was Jackie's third pregnancy loss, and it devastated her. Jack, for once, was genuinely present in his grief. He mourned their son deeply and was tender with Jackie in a way he rarely was. The loss brought them closer than they had been in years. In the aftermath, Jack seemed to recommit to their marriage, to be more attentive, more present. They began to talk about life after the presidency, about growing old together, about possibilities beyond politics. Jackie needed time to recover, both physically and emotionally. She went to Greece with her sister Lee to recuperate, staying on Aristotle Onassis' yacht, the Christina. Onassis, a Greek shipping magnate and one of the world's richest men, was Lee's friend and possibly more. He was charming, attentive to Jackie in her grief, and represented a world of wealth and leisure far removed from the pressures of Washington. When Jackie returned to the United States in October 1963, she seemed renewed. She agreed to accompany Jack on a political trip to Texas in November, something she rarely did for domestic political travel. She wanted to support him, wanted to show that they were a united team. It was meant to be a routine political trip, a chance to shore up support in a state where Democrats were divided, and Kennedy's re-election in 1964 was uncertain. No one could have imagined what was about to happen. Chapter 7, November 22nd, 1963. The day started ordinarily enough. November 22nd, 1963, was warm and sunny in Dallas, Texas. Jackie wore a pink Chanel suit with a matching pillbox hat and white gloves. She looked perfect, as always. The motorcade through Dallas was meant to showcase the president and first lady to the crowds, to generate enthusiasm and support. Jackie sat to the left of Jack in the back of the open Lincoln Continental. Governor John Connolly and his wife Nellie sat in the jump seats in front of them. As they turned onto Elm Street and passed the Texas School Book Depository at 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, Nellie Connolly turned and said, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Jack replied, "That's very obvious." They were the last words Jackie heard her husband speak. The first shot missed. The second shot hit Jack in the upper back and exited through his throat. The third shot struck the right side of his head, causing catastrophic damage. Jackie screamed, "What are they doing? My God, they've killed Jack. They've shot my husband. And then, I love you, Jack." What happened next has been analyzed, debated, and mythologized for decades. Jackie climbed onto the trunk of the moving car. She was reaching for a piece of her husband's skull, blown off by the shot, though she later said she had no memory of doing this. Secret Service agent Clint Hill climbed onto the back of the car and pushed her back into her seat, shielding both Kennedys with his body. The limousine raced to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Jackie held Jack's shattered head in her lap, trying to keep the skull together, covered in his blood. She refused to let go of him, even when they arrived at the hospital. Finally, she released him to the doctors, still holding a piece of his skull. For the next hour, doctors worked desperately to save the president's life, but the head wound was unsurvivable. At 1 p.m. Central Time, John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. Jackie was brought into the room. She kissed her husband's hand, his foot, and then placed her wedding ring on his finger. Someone suggested she change clothes, wash off the blood. She refused. "No, let them see what they've done," she said. The blood-soaked pink suit became one of the enduring images of that day, a silent testimony to violence and loss. She accompanied Jack's body back to Air Force One, where Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. She stood beside him, still in the blood-stained suit, as he took the oath of office. The photograph of that moment is one of the most famous images of the 20th century. Jackie's face blank with shock, her suit dark with her husband's blood, American democracy continuing even in the midst of tragedy. The flight back to Washington was surreal. Jackie sat in the back of the plane with Jack's coffin. She refused to leave it. She was in shock, operating on autopilot, but already thinking about how Jack should be remembered, how this should be handled. When they arrived at Andrews Air Force Base, Bobby Kennedy, who had loved Jackie as much as or more than his own brother did, climbed into the plane and held her. She told him, they killed him. They killed Jack. Then she helped supervise the removal of the coffin, insisting on walking out with it, visible to the cameras waiting below. The next 4 days were a masterclass in public grief and private strength. Jackie planned every detail of the funeral with extraordinary precision and historical awareness. She knew this was not just a personal loss. It was a national trauma, a historical moment that would be remembered for generations. She was determined to make it worthy of the man and the office. She modeled the funeral on Abraham Lincoln's, complete with the horse-drawn caisson, the riderless horse with boots reversed in the stirrups, the lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda. She insisted on walking in the procession from the White House to St. Matthew's Cathedral, a decision that terrified the Secret Service, but that she refused to compromise on. 1 million people lined the streets. The images of Jackie, veiled in black, walking with dignity through her grief, became iconic. At the funeral, her 3-year-old son John saluted his father's coffin on his 3rd birthday. It was Jackie who had taught him the salute, who had told him to do it. The photograph of little John saluting became one of the most poignant images of the 20th century. After the funeral service, Jackie accompanied the coffin to Arlington National Cemetery, where Jack was buried on a sloping hillside. She lit the eternal flame that still burns at his grave. She accepted the folded flag from the honor guard. She thanked the world leaders who had come to pay respects. And she survived, hour by hour, minute by minute. But underneath the public composure, she was shattered. She had witnessed her husband's murder, held his dying body, then covered in his blood. She had trauma that would haunt her for the rest of her life. For years afterward, she couldn't talk about that day without breaking down. She had nightmares. She grieved in ways both public and intensely private. A week after the funeral, she gave an interview to Theodore White of Life magazine. She wanted to shape how Jack's presidency would be remembered. She told White about how Jack loved the musical Camelot, particularly the final song about the brief shining moment. She deliberately created the myth of Camelot for the Kennedy administration, a myth that persists to this day despite historical evidence of the presidency's complications and shortcomings. It was brilliant public relations and probably necessary for her own survival. She needed Jack's death to mean something, his presidency to represent something beautiful and noble. The truth was more complex, but the myth was what the nation needed, what she needed. Jackie remained in the White House for 2 weeks after the assassination, packing, preparing to move, trying to figure out what came next. On December 6, 1963, she and her children moved into a borrowed house in Georgetown. She was 34 years old, a widow, with 2 young children, and no clear path forward. Chapter 8: The Widow Years. The months after Dallas were the darkest of Jackie's life. She was grieving, traumatized, trying to be strong for her children while barely holding herself together. She was also the object of enormous public sympathy and attention, which made private grief impossible. The nation had adopted her grief as their own. Thousands of letters poured in, tens of thousands, eventually more than 1 million. People sent condolences, shared their own grief, offered help and support, and sometimes bizarre suggestions. Jackie tried to answer as many as possible, working with the staff to send responses, but it was overwhelming. She was also suddenly concerned about money. Jack had left her with less than she expected. His estate was valued at several $100,000, a comfortable amount, but not a fortune. She received a widow's pension and Secret Service protection for herself and her children, but she worried about the future, about paying for Carolyn and John's education, about maintaining the lifestyle they'd known. More pressuringly, she had no privacy. Photographers followed her everywhere. Tourists gathered outside her Georgetown house, hoping for a glimpse. Every outfit she wore, every public appearance, every decision about her children was news. She felt hunted. In the fall of 1964, she made a decision that many criticized. She bought a 15-room apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue in New York City for $200,000. It was expensive, but it gave her anonymity that Washington couldn't provide. In New York, she was just one wealthy widow among many. Caroline could attend private school. John could play in Central Park, and they could attempt something like a normal life. Bobby Kennedy became her anchor during this period. He was grieving Jack too, and he and Jackie formed a bond that was perhaps deeper than either of them fully acknowledged. Some historians have suggested they had an affair, though there's no definitive evidence. What's certain is that they needed each other, understood each other's grief, and provided each other comfort. Bobby's children and Jackie's children spent time together. Bobby advised Jackie on money, on career decisions, on managing the Kennedy legacy. When Bobby decided to run for Senate from New York in 1964, Jackie supported him, appearing at campaign events despite her reluctance to return to politics. She also began to venture out socially, cautiously rebuilding a life beyond grief. She went to the theater, to restaurants, to parties. She was still young, still beautiful, and men were interested. But dating as Jackie Kennedy was impossible. Any man she was seen with became instant news, subjected to intense scrutiny and speculation. In 1965, she established the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Project, working to create a fitting memorial to Jack's presidency. She was involved in every aspect, from choosing the architect, pay, to selecting what materials would be included. It gave her purpose, a way to honor Jack while beginning to move forward with her own life. She also became more openly critical of Lyndon Johnson, who she felt had politicized Jack's death, and was exploiting the Kennedy legacy for his own purposes. The relationship between Jackie and the Johnson administration grew increasingly cold. Her relationship with Lee, her sister, became complicated during this period. Lee had separated from her husband and was spending time with Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate Jackie had met after Patrick's death. Onassis was fascinated by Jackie, pursued her attention, invited her on cruises, and showered her children with gifts and attention. At first, Jackie saw him as merely a distraction, a wealthy man who could provide escape and luxury. But gradually, she began to see him differently. He offered something Jack never had, complete, focused attention. When Onassis was with Jackie, she was his entire focus. He anticipated her needs, protected her from intrusion, made her feel special and valued. In June 1968, everything changed again. Bobby Kennedy, running for president, was assassinated in Los Angeles just after winning the California primary. Jackie was devastated. She'd lost Jack, then Bobby. The violence, the grief, the impossibility of protecting anyone she loved overwhelmed her. At Bobby's funeral, she reportedly told a friend, "I hate this country. I despise America, and I don't want my children to live here anymore. If they're killing Kennedys, my kids are #1 targets." It was grief talking, rage talking, trauma talking, but it was also real. Within weeks, she made a decision that shocked the world. She agreed to marry Aristotle Onassis. Chapter 9. M.R.S. Onassis. The announcement came in October 1968. Jacqueline Kennedy would marry Aristotle Onassis. The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. America felt betrayed. How could Jackie, America's grieving widow, their tragic princess, marry this crude Greek millionaire? He was 23 years older than her, short, not particularly handsome, and very much not American. It felt like a desecration of Jack's memory. The press called her Jackie O with a sneer. A Vatican newspaper condemned the marriage. Former friends expressed disappointment. The myth of Camelot, which Jackie had so carefully constructed, seemed tarnished by this new alliance. But Jackie didn't care about public opinion anymore. She cared about safety, security, and escape. Onassis could provide all three. He had his own island, Scorpios, where she and her children could be safe from photographers and assassins. He had virtually unlimited wealth. He was offering her a new life, away from the grief and violence that had consumed the past 5 years. They married on October 20th, 1968, on Scorpios in a Greek Orthodox ceremony. Carolyn and John were there, looking confused and uncomfortable. Lee was not invited, as her own relationship with Onassis had ended when he turned his attention to Jackie. The Kennedy family largely boycotted the event, appalled by what they saw as Jackie's betrayal of Jack's memory. The marriage was, from the start, a complex arrangement. There was a 173-clause prenuptial agreement that essentially made Jackie a very well-compensated companion. She would receive a substantial allowance, jewelry, and eventually a settlement of at least $3 million if they divorced or when Onassis died. It was a business arrangement dressed up as romance, and for a while it worked. Jackie could finally be anonymous. On Scorpios or on Onassis's yacht, she was protected from paparazzi by private security. She could swim, read, spend time with her children without being photographed. Onassis lavished her with gifts, jewelry from Bulgari and Van Cleef and Arpels, clothing from Valentino and Dior, anything she wanted. But Onassis was also frequently absent, focused on his business empire. He was crude in ways that grated on Jackie's refined sensibilities. He resented the attention her children required and the money they cost. He wanted her to be available when he needed her, but was unconcerned with her needs when he didn't. He also continued to see his longtime mistress, Maria Callas, the opera singer he'd been involved with before pursuing Jackie. He wasn't particularly discreet about it. Jackie found herself in an oddly familiar position, married to a wealthy, powerful man who was frequently unfaithful and emotionally unavailable. She traded the pressure of being a Kennedy for the isolation of being Mrs. Onassis, and it wasn't clear she'd gotten the better deal. She focused on her children. Carolyn was a teenager, navigating adolescence while being one of the most famous children in the world. John was becoming a young man, handsome and charming like his father, but also struggling with the weight of expectations and legacy. Jackie was fiercely protective of both, tried to give them as normal a life as possible given their circumstances. She spent increasing amounts of time in New York rather than Greece. She took Carolyn and John to museums, to the theater, to restaurants. She tried to expose them to culture and ideas while protecting them from the glare of publicity. It was a delicate balance and largely successful. Both children grew up remarkably well adjusted given the circumstances. By the mid-1970s, the Onassis marriage was essentially over in all but name. They maintained appearances occasionally, but they lived largely separate lives. Onassis's business empire was facing difficulties, his health was failing, and his relationship with Jackie had devolved into mutual resentment punctuated by arguments about money. Aristotle Onassis died on March 15, 1975, in Paris. Jackie was not with him. They'd been separated for months. His daughter Christina hated Jackie and fought to minimize her inheritance. After legal battles, Jackie settled for $26 million, far more than the prenuptial agreement had specified, but less than she might have claimed as a widow. She was now Jackie Kennedy Onassis, 45 years old, wealthy in her own right, and finally, after decades of being defined by the men she married, free to define herself. Chapter 10. Working Woman. In September 1975, 6 months after Onassis's death, Jackie did something that surprised many people. She got a job. She became a consulting editor at Viking Press, a prestigious New York publishing house. She worked 3 days a week, had her own office, and earned $10,000 a year, a token salary given her wealth, but meaningful in that she was actually working. Many people assumed it was a publicity stunt, that Viking had hired her name rather than her skills. But Jackie proved them wrong. She worked hard, read manuscripts, edited text, attended editorial meetings, and generally functioned as a real editor. She had always loved books and literature, and now she could be part of creating them. She was good at it, too. She had excellent taste, strong opinions, and the social connections to attract major authors. She was particularly interested in art books, memoirs, and cultural history. She worked on books about ballet, about Egypt, about architecture and design. In 1977, after a dispute about a novel Viking wanted to publish that fictionalized the Kennedy assassination, Jackie resigned and moved to Doubleday, another major publisher. She would work there for the next 15 years, becoming a senior editor, acquiring and editing important books, and building a reputation as a serious professional. Her colleagues were initially intimidated by her, but came to respect her work ethic and editorial judgment. She was collaborative, thoughtful, and didn't expect special treatment. She took the subway to work, had lunch at her desk, and participated in the ordinary rituals of office life. It was, in many ways, the most normal period of her adult life. She was also building relationships on her own terms. She dated occasionally, mostly men from her social world, wealthy, cultured, discreet. She had a long relationship with Maurice Templesman, a Belgian-born diamond merchant who was married but separated from his wife. Templesman was intelligent, cultured, and devoted to Jackie. He managed her financial affairs, accompanied her to cultural events, and provided companionship without demanding marriage or public acknowledgement. It was perhaps the healthiest romantic relationship of her life. Templesman asked nothing of her except herself. He didn't need her name or her connections. He simply enjoyed her company and wanted to make her happy. She bloomed in this relationship, became more relaxed, more herself. She was also deeply involved in historic preservation, particularly in New York City. In 1975, she helped lead the fight to save Grand Central Terminal from demolition, appearing at rallies and using her celebrity to draw attention to the cause. The campaign was successful, and Jackie became increasingly active in preservation efforts, working to protect buildings and neighborhoods from developers. She served on the board of the Municipal Art Society, attended planning meetings, and was a vocal advocate for protecting New York's architectural heritage. It was work that mattered to her, that connected to her lifelong interest in art and history, and that made a tangible difference. Her children were now adults. Carolyn graduated from Harvard, got married to Edwin Schlossberg in 1986, and began having children of her own. Jackie became a grandmother, a role she embraced with delight. She doted on her grandchildren, was involved in their lives, and seemed to find real joy in this next generation. John had a more complicated path. He was impossibly handsome, charming, and seemed destined for either politics or celebrity or both. He went to law school, worked in the Manhattan District Attorney's office, and eventually founded George Magazine, a glossy political publication. Jackie had mixed feelings about his very public life, but supported him as best she could while respecting his independence. In her 60s, Jackie achieved something remarkable. She became her own person. Not Jack Kennedy's widow, not Aristotle Onassis' wife, but Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis, editor, preservationist, grandmother, and New Yorker. She had carved out a life that was meaningful on her own terms. Chapter 11, Final Chapter. In November 1993, Jackie was thrown from her horse during a fox hunt in Virginia. It wasn't a serious fall, but she experienced pain and swelling afterward. By January 1994, she was having other symptoms: swollen lymph nodes, fatigue, night sweats. In February, she was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system. She underwent chemotherapy at New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center, trying to beat the disease with the same determination she'd brought to everything else. But the cancer was aggressive. By April, it was clear the treatment wasn't working. The cancer had spread to her brain and liver. Jackie made the decision to stop treatment and go home. She wanted to die in her own apartment, surrounded by her children and the things she loved, not in a hospital. It was characteristic she would control what she could control, even in dying. Whereas Templesman was with her constantly during those final weeks, Carolyn and John rarely left her side. She spent her days surrounded by books, by photographs, by the artwork she'd collected over a lifetime. She saw a few close friends, said her goodbyes, and prepared for the end with the same meticulous planning she'd brought to everything else. She died on May 19, 1994, at 10:15 p.m., at age 64. She was at home, as she'd wanted, with Carolyn holding one hand and John holding the other. Morris Templesman was there too, grieving the woman he'd loved for 17 years. The news was announced just before midnight. The nation mourned again, this time for the woman rather than the widow. Tributes poured in from around the world. President Clinton praised her grace and dignity. Ordinary Americans who had watched her for decades felt a genuine sense of loss. Her funeral was held on May 23rd at the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola in New York, the same church where she'd been baptized 64 years earlier. It was private, only about 300 invited guests, exactly as she'd specified. Carolyn read a poem. John gave a eulogy that was loving and personal. Morris Templesman read excerpts from Greek poetry that Jackie had loved. She was buried at Arlington National Cemetery next to President Kennedy and near their two infant children, Patrick and Arabella. The gravesite was already one of the most visited places in Washington. Now it became even more significant. Epilogue: The Real Jackie. Who was Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis? Even now, decades after her death, the question is complicated. She was so many things: daughter, sister, wife, widow, mother, grandmother, editor, preservationist, icon. She was the most photographed woman of her era, yet remained essentially private. She was admired by millions who never really knew her. She was born into privilege, but experienced profound loss and trauma. She married for love and for position, and both marriages were complicated and ultimately disappointing in different ways. She witnessed her husband's murder and survived it, then built a new life from the ruins of the old one. She was incredibly strong, but also vulnerable. She was dignified, but also fun-loving. She was private, but also performative when necessary. She contained multitudes, contradictions, complexities that the simple narratives could never capture. Her greatest achievement, perhaps, was her children. Carolyn and John grew up to be thoughtful, grounded people despite the impossible circumstances of their childhoods. They were kind, intelligent, and relatively normal, which, given what they'd been through and who their parents were, was remarkable. Jackie's fierce protection of them, her insistence on giving them as normal a life as possible, succeeded in ways that mattered more than any public accomplishment. Her second greatest achievement might be her own survival and reinvention. She could have remained a tragic widow, frozen in 1963, living off sympathy and grief. Instead, she built a life. She worked, loved, created, contributed. She became someone beyond the pink suit in the Camelot myth. She made mistakes. She could be cold, cutting, and difficult. She was sometimes self-absorbed and often materialistic. She married Onassis for security rather than love, which was honest but not particularly romantic. She wasn't perfect, wasn't a saint, wasn't always admirable. She was human, but she endured. Through her father's abandonment and alcoholism, through a difficult first marriage, through the murder of her husband, through the grief and trauma and endless public scrutiny, through a second difficult marriage and widowhood again, through it all, she endured. And more than that, she lived. She found moments of happiness, created beauty, protected her children, contributed to culture and historic preservation, and maintained her dignity and her sense of self. In her final years, she achieved what she'd always wanted: privacy, autonomy, meaningful work, and the freedom to be herself. The woman who had been public property for so long finally belonged to herself. She was no longer Jackie Kennedy, tragic widow. She was Jacqueline Onassis, editor and grandmother and New Yorker, and fully realized human being. The pink suit from Dallas, still stained with blood, is in the National Archives, sealed from public view until 2103. It's probably fitting. The trauma of that day, the violence and loss, deserves to be remembered, but not exploited. Jackie would have approved of that protection, that dignity. What she'd want remembered isn't the assassination or the marriages or the mythology. What she'd want remembered is something simpler and more profound: that she was a woman who loved her children, valued privacy, created beauty, and survived impossible things with grace. In the end, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis was neither the saint the public wanted her to be, nor the cold princess some of her critics claimed. She was a complicated, brilliant, sometimes difficult woman who lived an extraordinary life as honestly as she could manage given the circumstances. She was shaped by privilege and tragedy, by ambition and loss, by public expectation and private need. She was simply and profoundly herself, and that ultimately was her greatest achievement in a world that wanted to own her, define her, and reduce her to a symbol. She remained stubbornly, persistently, triumphantly human. The cameras caught her image millions of times, but they never quite captured her. The essence of Jackie, the real woman behind the icon, remained hers alone. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Some mysteries deserve to remain mysterious. Some privacy deserves to be protected, even in retrospect. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis gave the world her grace, her style, her contribution to culture and historic preservation. She gave her children stability and love despite impossible circumstances. But she kept her core self private, protected her own. And in doing that, in maintaining that boundary between public and private, even under the most intense scrutiny imaginable, she achieved a kind of victory. She proved that even in the modern age of mass media and celebrity culture, it was possible to retain some essential self, some part that the cameras couldn't touch. That might be her most important legacy, not what she showed the world, but what she successfully kept for herself. In an age of oversharing and constant exposure, she demonstrated that privacy isn't just possible, it's essential. That there are parts of ourselves that should be protected, kept sacred, reserved for the people we love and trust. She lived with grace through impossible circumstances. She survived tragedies that would have broken most people. She reinvented herself when the world wanted to keep her frozen in grief. She worked when she didn't have to, contributed when she could have simply spent, and maintained her dignity when everything and everyone conspired to strip it away. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis wasn't perfect, but she was remarkable. And her story, in all its complexity and contradiction, remains one of the most compelling of the 20th century. The little girl who watched her father as unreliability and her mother as cold ambition became the woman who witnessed history as greatest tragedies and survived them. The teenager who felt most herself in Paris became the first lady who brought culture and sophistication to the White House. The young widow in the blood-stained pink suit became the working editor taking the subway to her office. She was all of these people and none of them completely. She was whoever she needed to be in the moment, while keeping some essential core of herself inviolate and protected. She was, in the end, the architect of her own survival, the author of her own reinvention, the guardian of her own mystery. And that S who Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis really was. A woman who understood that survival sometimes requires transformation, that strength sometimes looks like retreat, and that the most important victories are often the quietest ones. She rests now at Arlington, next to the husband she loved and mourned, and whose memory she protected, even when the truth was more complicated than the myth. She's at peace finally, after a life lived in the most unrelenting spotlight imaginable. The cameras have finally stopped. The scrutiny has finally ended. The woman who was photographed millions of times, analyzed endlessly, mythologized and criticized and adored and condemned, has finally fully become private, and perhaps wherever she is, she's smiling at that. Privacy, after all, was what she always wanted most and so rarely got. In death, she has what eluded her in life: the right to be left alone, to rest undisturbed, to simply be without performance or expectation or endless observation. Good night, Jackie. The world is still talking about you, still fascinated by you, still trying to understand who you really were, but you, finally, don't have to answer. You don't have to perform or explain or justify. You can simply rest, private at last, your mysteries intact, your dignity preserved, your story told but never fully revealed. You survived. You endured. You lived on your own terms as much as anyone in your position possibly could, and that, in the end, is enough, more than enough. It's everything.